So this is Neo-Confucianism and Chinese Buddhism. I'm Professor Van Norden. This is part 2 of week 5 on Chinese Buddhism. And today we're going to be looking at some of the specific ways that Buddhism changed as it came into China. So China has a form of Mahayana Buddhism. In the previous lecture, we looked at some of the features that distinguish Mahayana Buddhism from Theravada Buddhism. But what about the significance of Buddhism in China specifically? That's what we're going to be looking at this week. So among there were a bunch of course, philosophical ideas that Mahayana Buddhism brought to China. And we talked a little bit about those last time, but also there were social and cultural differences and differences in what is called material culture. Culture is reflected in buildings and works of art and clothing and things like that. From a social perspective, some of the most important changes that Buddhism brought to China included the existence of a celibate clergy, monks and then later nuns who were celibate and were part of the Buddhist clergy. In China, before the arrival of Buddhism, you had Taoist priests, but they weren't necessarily celibate. And Confucians performed many rituals, but they certainly were not celibate. Not all religions have a celibate clergy, but Buddhism did. And given the strong emphasis in Confucianism on filial piety, including having children, the existence as a way of continuing the family line, the existence of a celibate clergy was really puzzling to people in the Chinese tradition. Like, well, why are you celibate, and why isn't that a violation of filial piety that you're celibate? In addition, the practice of not eating meat became a serious option in China with the arrival of Buddhism. So the arrival of veganism in China with Buddhism was a new thing. To this day, many Taoist priests still eat meat. It's not a universal thing, but that's not considered a deal breaker if you're a Taoist. It's certainly not a deal breaker eating meat if you're a Confucian, but Buddhists didn't eat meat, and this was a new thing. Meat was always a luxury item. It wasn't like it was a staple of everyone's diet, but if you could eat meat, you would eat meat. So veganism was a new thing that Buddhism brought to China. And of course, Buddhist monks and later Buddhist nuns shaved their hair off, and they wore distinctive clothing that marked them off from the rest of society, but also made sure they looked like everybody else. And they changed their names when they took vows as a monk or nun. Again, all these things they were intriguing to Confucians and Taoists and other Chinese people, but people also, as more and more Chinese people converted to Buddhism, they raised questions about, well, aren't you violating filial piety by leaving your family of origin, changing your name, failing to have children to carry on the family line, even cutting your hair? There's a tradition that because your parents gave you your body, it's part of filial piety to die with your body intact. And so shaving your hair was considered, in a way, people did trim their hair, of course, in traditional China, but completely shaving it off seemed like another violation of filial piety. So how did Buddhists react to this? So today we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at a document by Huiyuan on why Buddhist monks do not bow down before kings, which is going to defend some of the behavioral practices of Buddhist monks and nuns, some of the ways they acted and dressed, and explaining why that's justified. And then we're going to look at some excerpts from a longer work by Zongmi on humanity. And there is a complete book translation of this work that you can find if you want to read more about it. And Zongmi's On Humanity is an effort to explain the superiority of Buddhism, and in particular, the superiority of the kind of Mahayana Buddhism that Zongmi advocates to Confucianism, Daoism, and also its superiority to other forms of Buddhism. So those are the two things we're going to look at today. Oh, let's see if I can advance the slide here. So Huiyuan writes this work on why Buddhist monks do not bow down before kings. And one of the central things to notice about this work is the distinction he draws between, on the one hand, lay Buddhists, people who try to follow the Eightfold Path, which we talked about in a previous lecture. They try to follow the Eightfold Path, but they haven't taken monastic vows. So those are lay Buddhists, and Huiyuan distinguishes them from Buddhist. He's really primarily talking about Buddhist monks, but the same arguments will later apply to Buddhist nuns. And he says different rules apply to these two groups of people. And he explains in particular that looking into the basis for the main points elucidated by Buddhist teachings, we distinguish Buddhist practitioners according to whether or not they have left their families. Those who honor the Dharma, right? Dharma is a technical term in Buddhism. In its most basic sense, it can mean like a law, and it's often translated by the Chinese term fa, which means law. So Dharma can mean like a causal law, like the causal law that if you bring a flame in contact with flammable material, it will transmit the fire to the new material. That's governed by a dharma, a causal law. Dharma is also the moral law that genuinely virtuous actions have good consequences and bad actions have bad consequences. That's Dharma. Dharma can also refer to the teachings of Buddhism in general. And then in a really technical sense, Dharma can refer to one of those transient aspects of reality, like a contemporary configuration of material form, or a temporary thought, or a temporary feeling. We talked about the 5 skandhas, the 5 aggregates, in a previous lecture, and a dharma can be used as a technical term to refer to an instance of one of the 5 aggregates. But here, dharma refers to the law, the teachings of Buddhism. So those who honor the dharma, the teachings of Buddhism, like the Four Noble Truths, but stay in their families, that is to say Buddhist lay people, are subjects who comply with the transformations of the temporal world. Their basic feelings remain conventional, and their outward behavior conforms with what's within the bounds of the temporal world. Thus, they have love for those to whom they are related by birth, their parents, their siblings, and deferential rituals for honoring their superiors. So in other words, if you're a lay Buddhist, although you accept the Dharma, the teachings of Buddha, and you're going to try to follow the Eightfold Path, your basic behavior is not going to differ too much from that of other people in society. And the idea is that Huiyuan is reassuring people in Chinese society, particularly people in government, look, Buddhism is not a threat to social order. Most people who are going to become Buddhists are going to be Buddhist lay people, and their behavior won't differ that much from other people. They will they'll show filial piety to members of their family. They will bow down before kings and social superiors. They'll honor people who have passed the civil service examinations. They'll do all the things that good citizens are supposed to do. Therefore, they, and he's still talking about lay Buddhists, cannot withhold proper ritual deference for a ruler while receiving the benefits of his virtue, nor can they discard due reverence for him while soaking up the benefits of his kindness. For this reason, those who delight in the customs of the Buddha always first honor their parents and revere their lords. And he says, so the idea is, if you're a lay Buddhist, you're following the way of the Buddha, but you are receiving benefits from civil society, from the ruler. You're receiving benefits from your family. And so, of course, you revere them to express your thanks for the benefits you're receiving from government and the benefits you're receiving from your family. And then he adds, those who would change their conventions and cast off their hairpins, right? And why would you cast off your hairpin? Well, because you're going to cut your hair off and go bald to become a Buddhist monk or nun. Those who would change their conventions and cast off their hairpins in order to become monks must always await their parents' and rulers' sanction and act accordingly. So he says, don't worry, if you are a lay person who wants to become a monk or nun, you need the approval of your family and you need the approval of the ruler. So again, it's reassuring people that Buddhism is not a threat to social order. Well, what about people who become monks or nuns? Those who have left the family, right, and this means people who've gotten permission of their parents and of the ruler to become a Buddhist monk or nun, and so they're going to take monastic vows. Those who have left the family are guests beyond the temporal world. In their outward behavior, they are cut off from external things. Their doctrine leads them to understand that the reason they are burdened by suffering, right, is because they have a body, and that they can put an end to their suffering by not preserving the body. Right? I said in my first lecture on Buddhism, there are different ways in which you can understand the Four Noble Truths. Some truths really emphasize how much suffering there is in the world. And so that's what Huiyuan is doing here. He's saying, when you become a monk or a nun, you've recognized that the ultimate root of suffering is attachment to things in the ordinary temporal world. They understand that generating life depends on being subject to the transformations of the temporal world. And by refraining from following the transformations, they seek out the great ancestral source of the world. Because seeking out the great ancestral source doesn't depend on following the transformations of the temporal world, they do not value the resources required for participation in the cyclical changes. Because putting an end to their suffering doesn't depend on preserving the body, they do not value the benefits of life. So in other words, because as a Buddhist monk or nun, you're trying to transcend the physical world, you don't have to thank your parents for your body because you're trying to transcend your body. You don't need to thank your ruler for maintaining peace and prosperity because you're trying to transcend the world that is maintained by the emperor. So that's why you're going to change your clothes, you're going to cut your hair, you're going to change your name, you're going to, in many ways, step outside the world, but then you don't owe, in a sense, conventional filial piety anymore. You don't owe conventional reverence to rulers. Because they change from ordinary customs, their clothing and insignia of rank cannot conform to the same ritual standards specified by secular codes. Because they flee the world, they must raise their outward behavior to a higher level. In this way, they are able to rescue ordinary people from drowning in the flow of the temporal world and pull out the hidden roots from many eons of past lives. They convey themselves a great distance across the ford of the three vehicles, opening a path between heaven and humankind. If they cause just one person to develop complete virtue, then the way will permeate through that person's family, and that person's beneficence will flow to all under heaven. And I mentioned in the previous lecture on the differences between Theravada and Mahayana that one of the things characteristic of Mahayana is the belief that enlightened beings can share their virtue with other people. They can share their merit with other people. And so there's a hint here that if a Chinese Confucian or a ruler is wondering, well, what do we get from having Buddhist monks and nuns in our society? The idea is, well, if they cause just one person to develop complete virtue, then the way will permeate through that person's family, and that person's beneficence will flow to all under heaven. So goodness will flow from an enlightened Buddhist a monk or nun to other people in society. So everyone will end up benefiting. So that's why you'll benefit from having Buddhist monks and nuns in your society. And notice there are different ways of formulating Buddhism. So Buddhism is a very multifaceted movement, just like there are very different formulations of Christianity. There's different formulations of Judaism, Islam, and Hinduism. This formulation of Buddhism is really emphasizing that what you're trying to do is flee attachment to the physical world. And that's why you don't really owe anything anymore to your parents or the ruler, because they're about giving you life, which you're trying to leave behind, and giving you, social welfare food and peace and prosperity and things like that, but you don't want those things. There are other ways of formulating Buddhism that don't emphasize fleeing from the world, and we'll see some more about that later in the course. But there are versions of Buddhism, as we can see here, that really do emphasize how much suffering there is in life and that you want to transcend that suffering. But what we're seeing Huiyuan doing is warning people, saying, look, don't worry about there being Buddhist monks and nuns. First of all, lay Buddhists are going to act totally normally. If they become monks or nuns, it'll be because they got the approval of their family. And actually, everyone benefits from them because the merit from them will flow and benefit other people in society. Now we're going to turn to Zongmi, and this is a more philosophical defense of Buddhism. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about Zongmi is he uses this style of argumentation that you can find antecedents of it in Indian philosophy for sure, but it becomes very characteristic of Buddhist philosophy, the style of argument that Zongmi is giving. And we're going to see it in a lot of other Buddhist texts in China. And this style is you rank teachings at various levels depending on how close they are to fully expressing the truth of Buddhism and how close they are to the highest level of enlightenment. And this is like a really interesting philosophical position. And maybe you want to think about things like this yourself, other things. Do you just want to say that some views are wrong and one view is right? Or do you want to say, well, there's different levels of rightness. Some views are a little bit right, other views are more true, other views are still more true, and then maybe there's a view that's the most true, that's most comprehensive, but that doesn't mean that every other view is simply false. This implies that there are degrees of truthfulness of doctrines. Many philosophers would reject that, both in East and West. Many philosophers would say, no, truth is binary. Either you're true or you're not true, and not true means false. But some philosophers say, well, there are degrees of truth. You can get closer to truth. There's a way of understanding the Western philosopher Hegel, where truth is something that you gradually achieve over the course of history. And some ethical systems are higher than others, but that doesn't mean that the earlier ethical systems are completely immoral. They're just not as highly developed. Or some worldviews are more highly developed, but that doesn't mean that every other view before that is false. So there's something attractive about that kind of view. And this is what Zongmi is going to do. He's going to say, it's not that Confucianism and Daoism are immoral or completely false. It's that they're partial truths. And then he's going to talk about Theravadan Buddhism, which he's going to refer to using the derogatory term Hinayana. And again, don't use the term Hinayana, it's derogatory, but it is a term that we'll see in Mahayana Buddhist texts to refer to Theravada. So Hinayana is just a derogatory term for Theravadan Buddhism. Don't use Hinayana, but you need to know what it means because it will be used in Mahayana texts. And so Zongmi is going to say that his position, which is Huiyuan Buddhism, which is a kind of Mahayana, is the highest understanding, the most comprehensive understanding, and that Theravadan Buddhism, which he calls Hinayana, is almost as good, but not quite as profound. And then Confucianism and Daoism, they've got some things right, but they're not as sophisticated as Hinayana. And he's going to give you some actually very well-reasoned philosophical arguments for thinking this. But he starts out by saying, those who practice Confucianism and Daoism, which are the two native philosophical movements that had survived from the period of the 100 schools in ancient China. Those who practice Confucianism and Daoism only know the following. In the short term, they receive their bodily form via a continuous transmission from their ancestors and forefathers. In the long term, the one qi, right? So qi is this stuff, primordial stuff that things condense out of. So qi is the most primordial kind of stuff that first condenses as air is qi, mist is qi, water is qi, and then earth and rocks and human bodies, everything physical is condensed out of this one underlying physical stuff, which is called qi. We talked about that in a previous lesson. In the long term, the one qi of the primordial chaos divides into two, yin and yang. We talked about yin and yang in a previous lecture. Yin and yang are complementary opposites, dark and light, passive and active, feminine and masculine, falling and rising, wet and dry, so on. These two generate three, heaven, earth, and humans. These three generate the myriad things, all the different things, kinds of things there are. So the myriad things in humans have qi as their foundation. And he says, this is what Confucianism and Daoism teach. He's not going to say it's fundamentally wrong, but he says it's incomplete. However, Kongzi, Laozi, and Shakyamuni were all perfect sages. Who's Shakyamuni? If you remember back to our first lecture on Buddhism, I said Shakyamuni is another name for Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, the founder of Buddhism. However, Kongzi Laozi is the historical founder of Taoism. Kongzi, better known in the West as Confucius, is the historical founder of Confucianism. So Kongzi, Laozi, Shakyamuni are the founders of respectively Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. However, Kongzi, Laozi, and Shakyamuni were all perfect sages who established their teachings along different paths in accordance with their eras and the circumstances they responded to. So he's explaining why they taught different things. He said, well, their audiences needed to hear different things. Their esoteric and exoteric teachings complement one another and benefit the masses of people. So I mentioned this in passing in a previous lecture. It's a common distinction in religious studies to talk about the exoteric, the outward-facing teachings of religion, and the esoteric, the hidden or most profound teachings of the religion. Some religions avowedly, explicitly have a distinction between exoteric and esoteric teachings. The teachings you tell beginners and you tell the public versus the hidden teachings you tell the initiates and the advanced students. Other teachings, other religions have esoteric aspects to them, but it's not an official doctrine that there is an esoteric teaching. But you do find this distinction in many religious traditions. So Zongmi is saying, talking about Confucianism, Daoism, and Buddhism, he's saying they all have these esoteric, hidden, advanced teachings, and exoteric, more shallow, public teachings. But he says for all of them, their esoteric and exoteric teachings complement one another and benefit the masses of people. But although each of them is a sage, so he's acknowledging Confucius is a sage, Laozi is a sage, and of course, the Buddha is a sage. There are distinctions between those that gave full explanations and those that gave conditional explanations. And so part of the suggestion is that at some level, maybe Kongzi understood everything that Shakyamuni was talking about, but he just didn't express it fully to the people in his era because they weren't ready to hear it. Now, at this point, then, the next thing that Zongmi does is he raises some philosophical problems that both Confucianism and Taoism face. For the purposes of this, he doesn't sharply distinguish them. He says, look, they both face these problems. I'm not going to discuss all the problems he raises. Feel free in the question section to raise some objections or discuss some of the, you can also raise objections, but discuss some of the other objections that Zongmi raises. But I'm going to focus on a couple of them. So one of the issues that Zongmi raises for Confucianism and Taoism, he says, look, according to you guys, according to you Confucians and Taoists, everything arises from the primordial qi, this original undifferentiated qi, which condenses to make specific things. He says, well, the qi of heaven and earth is fundamentally lacking in awareness, right? Because qi is, it's not, as I said before, it's in a previous lecture, it's not like matter, it's not quite like mass energy, but, in its original form, it's somewhat similar to something like that. It's the stuff, the inert stuff out of which things come into existence. But then Zongmi says, if humans are endowed with qi that lacks awareness, how can awareness suddenly arise? Grass and trees are endowed with the same qi, so why do they not have awareness? So this is interesting because this is a philosophical problem that Western philosophers wrestle with as well. How do mental states, how does consciousness arise from inert matter? So it appears that in the world, again, qi isn't exactly like mass energy or Newtonian matter, but we have a similar problem, which is when we have this stuff, we have atoms and molecules, which we don't think have mental states. But somehow when you combine atoms and molecules in a certain way, you get humans who have mental states, who have consciousness, who have awareness. And I think my dog and my cat also have consciousness and awareness, not exactly the same as mine, but I think that they feel pain. I think they feel affection for me, like I feel affection for them. These are, but atoms and molecules don't feel affection. They don't feel pain. They don't have awareness. So how does consciousness arise from matter? And so Zongmi says, hey, Confucians and Daoists, how do you guys explain that? He's later going to offer an explanation. And the fact, he says, that Huiyuan Buddhism can answer this question of how consciousness arises from matter shows that Huiyuan Buddhism is a superior and more comprehensive philosophy. The second problem that Zongmi talks about is, and I'm using a Western term to describe this problem, but the problem, it's structurally the same problem. And here's how, let me just start with how Zongmi phrases it. Another problem, and he means a problem that Confucianism and Daoism cannot solve on their own terms. Another problem concerns their claim that poverty and wealth, prestige and lowliness, worthiness and ignorance, goodness and badness, good fortune and bad fortune, calamities and prosperity are all fated by heaven. He says this is something that Confucians and Taoists both say. But if this is the case, then why does heaven, in assigning fates, give so many poverty and so few wealth, so many lowliness and so few prestige? Why, in general, does so many face calamity and so few enjoy prosperity? If the allotments are up to heaven, why is heaven so unfair? Right? So why are some people born rich and some people born in grinding poverty? Why are some people born with excellent health and other people are born with conditions that make them suffer a lot of pain? Pinky would like to say hi again. Hi, Pinky. You want to say hi? You want to say hi? Okay, sorry. Why are some people born, like my daughter, I mean, both my kids really, when they were, young, they were very smart, but my daughter, people in school would just comment like, oh, Melissa's so smart. My son had to struggle in school more, and he eventually kept working and eventually became an excellent student. But like, why should there be any difference? Why shouldn't, school be as easy for both my kids? Or, why should school be hard for some people and difficult for others? Why should some people be natural athletes and other people like me be very clumsy? Why should some people be good looking and other people like me be kind of meh? Why does heaven do that? Moreover, he says, there are those who do wrong but get prestige, those who do right but are impoverished, those who lack virtue but are wealthy, those who have virtue but are poor. The unruly have good fortune, while the righteous have bad fortune. The benevolent are short-lived, while the cruel are long-lived. In general, those who follow the way are taken down, while those who abandon the way rise up. Since this is all due to heaven, heaven must raise up those who abandon the way and pull down those who have the way. Is there no way in which the good and humble are rewarded with prosperity, or the licentious and arrogant are punished with calamity? Now, this is a problem that's going to arise. This issue that Zongmi is raising is going to arise in any worldview that is broadly teleological. That's a term we talked about again in an earlier lecture. A teleological worldview is one in which there's a higher power, in this case, heaven. that is structuring the world so that things have a built-in purpose, a goal, an end, in the technical sense of that term, a telos. But if things are endowed by heaven with a purpose, a goal, or end, why does heaven, or if you believe in God, why does God seem to give people very different life circumstances? Some people seem to be very bad, but it seems like, they're really lucky in life. For goodness sakes, Justin Bieber is a gosh darn millionaire, right? Is that because he's a wonderful human being? I don't actually have anything against Justin Bieber per se, but it's not like he seems like he's a saint or something, but he's has this really wonderful life. Other people are really great people and they can suffer a lot. So if the universe has some kind of teleology, some moral order built into it, why very often do the good suffer and the vicious seem to flourish? And in the West, you call this the problem of theodicy. Specifically, what theos means God. And so theodicy is specifically this problem, the problem of evil, or the problem of explaining why God lets bad things happen to good people and lets good things happen to bad people. But the same general issue is going to arise in any system where you've got a teleological worldview. And so Zongmi is saying, hey, Confucians and Taoists, what's your explanation for this? Right? Why does this happen? So then Zongmi starts to explain the doctrine of no self as it's explicated in Theravada Buddhism. Now, again, I'm going to quote him, and he uses the term Hinayana. Don't you use the term Hinayana? Hinayana means lesser vehicle, Mahayana means greater vehicle, and the term Hinayana is a derogatory term used by some Mahayanists to refer to Theravadan Buddhists. But he's explaining Theravada Buddhism, which we've talked about in previous lectures. According to the teaching of Hinayana, this is Zongmi explaining Theravada, due to the power of causes and conditions, the forms of the body and the thoughts of the mind are born and perish every instant in a never-ending succession without any beginning. They are like the flowing of a stream or the flickering of a lamp, right? So physical existence or human consciousness is like the flowing of a stream or the flickering of a lamp, where, and again, physics tells us this is right, at the atomic and subatomic levels, even at the basic biological level, a living organism like a human body is always changing. But we know even at the atomic level, I mean, atoms are always in motion and always interacting with other atoms. And so things are in a constant state of change, and our mental states are in a constant state of change. He continues, bodily form and mind contingently combine, seeming to be a unity and seeming to be constant. The ignorant unconsciously cling to them as the I. So this changing stream of mental and physical states, you cling to it and you identify that as an I, as if there were a constant thing there. Valuing this I is what gives rise to the three poisons of craving, anger, and delusion. Craving is craving for fame and profit to glorify this I. Anger is anger at what is contrary to the feelings, fearing that they will injure this I. Delusion is succumbing to fantasies that are contrary to the pattern. The pattern is the structure of the universe, is a term we'll talk about a lot later in the course. The three poisons stir up thoughts and instigate actions and speech that create all karmic consequences. Karma is almost a term, and it kind of is a term in English now, although we tend not to use it very precisely. Technically speaking, karma in Sanskrit refers to intentional action, right? So if I accidentally knock over a cup of coffee, that's not karma because I didn't do it intentionally. If I take a sip of my coffee intentionally, that's a karmic action. In English, we usually use the term karma to refer to what is technically called in Buddhism karma phala, the fruits of karmic action or the consequences of karmic action. And so the idea is that karmic action, intentional action, if it's good action, it has good consequences. If it's bad action, it has bad consequences. So he's saying the three poisons of craving, anger, and delusion stir up thoughts and instigate actions and speech that create all negative karmic consequences. And why do these negative karmic consequences come from our actions? Because we're attached to this delusion that there's an I. So this is basically explaining the doctrine of no self as we saw it was interpreted by Theravadan Buddhists like Nagasena in the Questions of King Milinda. Now, why might you believe this is true? He says, well, now if we extend our analysis, there are 4 elements of bodily form: earth, water, fire, and he says wind. Now, if you know traditional European physics, or also, interestingly, traditional Indian, like Nyaya physics, then you know that there's a view that there are 4 earthly elements: earth, water, fire, and we usually say air. And so it's really interesting that we don't normally talk about earth, water, fire, and air in the Chinese tradition, but because Zongmi is influenced by Indian works he's reading, he's using earth, water, fire, and wind to refer to 4 kinds of matter. And he said it's not something that you usually see in. There are 5 phases that we talked about in a previous lecture in the Chinese tradition. But interestingly, here, Zongmi is actually referring to the 4 elements of the earlier Indo-European tradition. But basically what he's saying is, well, look, what exists? Well, there's the elements of the body and the 4 aggregates of mind: sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness. And remember, we talked about the 5 aggregates. What are the 5 aggregates? Bodily form, and then sensation, perception, mental constructions, volitions of various kinds, and awareness or consciousness. And so he's just subdividing material form into the 4 elements. And he says sensation is the capacity for liking or disliking. Perception is the capacity for having mental representations. Volition is the capacity to create actions. Consciousness is the capacity to distinguish between things. If each of these were the I, there would be 8 selves. Right? Now, so we've got 4 elements and we've got 4 mental states. And he says, well, which of these things is the I? Is your I identical with the element of earth? Is it identical with volition? Those are 2 different things. Moreover, even within the element of earth, there are many more. There are 360 bones, each distinct from the others, along with skin, hair, muscles, liver, heart, spleen, and kidneys, each one different from the others. Likewise, the activities of the mind are not the same. Seeing is not hearing, delight is not anger, and so on. From here, we can go on to the 84,000 defilements of the body. What he means by that are things like, mucus and spit and urine and feces. The number of things is this vast. How can we know for certain which one to take as the I? If all of them are I, then I am a million different things. In one bodily form, these things alternate, taking control in a chaotic fashion. So, in other words, he's saying, look, think of what you are. All you are is a combination of varied physical and mental states. And if we tried to number them all, we'd have thousands of things. Which of those thousands of parts of your body are you? And if you say, well, I'm not any of the parts, well, are you all the parts taken together? Well, we saw when we looked at Nagasena why that's going to be problematic. Are you something different from all the parts? Well, we saw, again, looking at Nagasena, why that's going to be problematic. So if you try to find the self, he says, all you find is a plurality of different things that we conventionally label the I, but there's not really an I that corresponds to the word I or self. But what difference does it make whether that's true? He explains. So then, on whose account do we crave things or get angry? On whose account do we murder and steal? Or on whose account do we give to charity or abstain from wrongdoing? So when one does not obstruct the mind and does not allow it to have either good or bad effects in any of the 3 realms, but rather cultivates the awareness of no self in order to cut off craving and the other attachments, one ceases to produce any karmic consequences. This is to realize the true reality of the emptiness of the I and to become an arhat. One's body becomes ashes, awareness is extinguished, and one finally cuts off all suffering. So Again, remember we talked about in the earlier lecture, there's a distinction between the arhat and the bodhisattva. And a common Mahayana thing to say is that this distinction is central to the difference between Theravada and Mahayana, that the ideal supposedly of Theravadan Buddhism is the arhat, the person who achieves enlightenment, escapes the suffering of the world, but does it in a way just for this one stream of consciousness, this one stream of physical effects. And that's contrasted with the bodhisattva who achieves enlightenment for everybody. But the key idea here is that when you realize you don't have a self, you're not going to crave to own things for yourself because you don't have a self. You're not going to murder or steal. Who are you murdering or stealing for? Who are you angry at? Who is the object of your hate? So this is the ethical ideal that Zongmi is saying you can find in Theravadan Buddhism. But then he's going to go on and say, well, but Theravada Buddhism doesn't have a complete description of reality either. So Confucianism and Daoism, they're okay, but they don't have a complete explanation of what's going on in the world. Theravada has a higher explanation, a higher ethical ideal, but there's still things that Theravada can't explain. What can't Theravada explain? Well, he says this. He says, now I shall critique this view. He means Hinayana. The foundation of bodies over repeated lifetimes and countless universes must in its own substance be uninterrupted. However, the five sense experiences do not arise without causes. There are times when consciousness is not active, for example, in unconsciousness, sleep, extinction, and in some forms of meditation. And even the four elements are not necessary for the beings in the formless realm of heaven. How is it that these bodies are supported time after time without interruption? So this is it's a bit of a technical objection, but the idea is that if Theravada is correct, that all that exists are these transient physical and mental states, there's a problem in explaining why there's any persistence over time. So even if all that exists are transient physical and mental states, why do mental states keep producing later mental states? Why do earlier mental states keep producing later mental states? After all, these things are transient by their nature. How do they have a power to keep producing things in the future? So the argument that Zongmi is going to give is there has to be a ground that is eternal, that explains the continuing existence of these transient, changing physical and mental states, because these instances of physical and mental states can't explain the continuing production of other physical and mental states unless there's an ultimate ground for them. And he says that's what his version of Mahayana can explain. So he goes on to explain the superiority, in his view, of the particular kind of Mahayana that he advocates, which is Huiyuan Buddhism. He says, according to the teaching of the one vehicle that reveals the nature, everything that has feelings has a fundamentally conscious true mind. Without any beginning, it has always remained pure, shining without shadow, always completely knowing. It is also called the Buddha nature, or the storehouse of the thus come. The thus come is one of the expressions for talking about the Buddha. And it's a way of calling the Buddha the thus come, is a way of reflecting the fact that the Buddha is such a transformative being in history that he kind of transcends any ordinary description. So, but he says we can think about this pure, shining, true mind that everything shares. You can call it the Buddha nature, you can call it the storehouse of the thus come, but throughout time, misguided thoughts have covered it so that people are not conscious of it themselves, but only recognize the qualities of the everyday world. So they become entangled in karmic consequences and endure the bitterness of birth and death. The Buddha took pity on them and explained that everything is empty of a separate self. Moreover, he realized that the conscious true mind of purity is one with all the Buddhas. So the superiority of Mahayana lies in the fact that the Mahayana, particularly the Huiyuan position, is underlying all these transient dharma, these transient instantiations of mental and physical states. There's a reality which is perfect, pure, and unchanging. And that reality is a kind of mind. And that mind is not your mind, it's not my mind, it's a transpersonal mind that we all share. And the existence of this mind explains why things keep coming into existence, despite the fact that the things that apparently are coming into existence are themselves transient and limited. And you and I have the same Buddha nature. You and I have the same storehouse of the thus come. You and I have the same true mind. So as I said in a previous lecture, this is something that I really don't think any Indian Buddhist, even a Mahayana Buddhist, could say. Because the notion is that the doctrine of no self means that you don't have an individual self, but you share with everybody else, and not just with other humans, but with dogs and cats and flowers and grass and rocks and sand and the primordial chi, a common mind, which is the one universal mind we all have in common. And we fail to recognize that we share this common universal self, this common universal mind, because of delusions that have arisen that hide from us the true interconnected nature of our reality. So and a reason I say I don't think an Indian Buddhist could say this is it sounds very similar to a view that you get in some positions like, for example, Vedanta in the Indian tradition. So there's a universal self that we all share. And so I don't think an Indian Buddhist would say it, but in China, this ends up being how they interpreted the notion that you don't have an individual self, it's that you have a transpersonal self. Now, let's not forget about those objections that Zongmi raised to Confucianism and Daoism, right? One of them was the problem of theodicy, or why do bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people? Well, Zongmi explains, if you understand the teachings of Huiyuan, you have an explanation for that. Because of being reverent or disrespectful of the way, in a previous life, one suffers the consequences of being honored or lowly, with the benevolent being long-lived and the murderous short-lived, the generous being wealthy and the stingy poor, and various other rewards too numerous to mention. Consequently, we may find that this particular bodily self is unfortunate without having done any wrongs, fortunate without having done anything good, long-lived while lacking in benevolence, short-lived without having killed anyone, and so on. Why? These are all determined by the detailed karmic consequences of actions in previous lives. This is what accounts for the differences between what happens spontaneously, so-called, in one's current lifetime. Scholars of other schools do not know about previous existences, but only rely on what is currently visible to them, so they advocate only spontaneity. In other words, if you ask, well, that person seems like a really good person, but they had a lot of medical problems in their life, they had a lot of setbacks that weren't their faults, how could the universe be a fair place? And the answer is, don't worry. They'll be rewarded in a future life for the good things they've accomplished in this life, but they're being punished in this life for bad things they did in a previous life. And likewise, if you see somebody who has a lot of luck and everything goes their way, but they seem like they're kind of a jerk human being, well, that's because they're being rewarded for good things they did in a previous life. But because they squandered the good fortune they had in this life and didn't use it to do good things, they will be punished for that in a future life. So it's a way of reconciling this phenomenon of bad things happening to good people and good things happening to bad people with teleology by saying, in the long run, if you take into account multiple lives, people get exactly what they deserve. So, and he says, we Huiyuan Buddhists can account for this, but Confucians and Taoists cannot solve the problem of theodicy. And then remember the problem of consciousness. And the problem was, well, how does consciousness come into existence in a world in which it seems that things are constructed out of qi, which doesn't seem to be conscious? And again, this is a problem that Western philosophers wrestle with too. And the solution that Zongmi offers is, he says, the qi with which we are endowed, when we infer all the way back to its foundation, is the primordial qi of the undifferentiated chaos referred to by the Confucians and Taoists. So he's not questioning that, yeah, the universe comes into existence from a kind of primordial soup of something like, not mass energy exactly, but if you imagine like things coming into existence out of mass energy that then becomes particles, that's not the image isn't too far off from the way these guys are thinking of it. But he says the mind that arises when we investigate it thoroughly to its source is the spiritual mind of genuine unity. To put it most precisely, there's nothing outside the mind. Even the primordial qi is a transformation of the mind. It belongs to the transformation of consciousness into the objects of perception, which is part of the phenomenal aspect of the storehouse consciousness. That phrase is a lot to bite on, but the basic idea is that what exists originally is simply a mind that is conscious, and the mind creates mental states, but then at some point it becomes confused about the nature of the mental states, and it starts to think of the mental states as entities separate from it. And that's the origin of the world as we know it. It's kind of like if you imagined a being that was just pure consciousness and it started to dream. And at first it understood that the dream was just its dream. But then at a certain point, it got so into the dream that it started to think the dream was real and the dream was an independent reality. And it even started to think that there were separate people in the dream. And it started to identify with one of the people in the dream instead of recognizing that it was the dreamer, right? So when you have a dream, I mean, this is my experience of dreams. When I'm in a dream, sometimes I can lucidly dream and I'm aware that I'm in a dream. But other times when I'm having a dream, I'm a character in the dream and I'm interacting with other people in the dream. And I think I'm just one person here and these other characters are other personalities. But really, I'm the dreamer. The character in the dream is just who I call me, is just another projection of my mind. So that is how Zongmi is suggesting, that's how consciousness arises. Now, this might seem like a crazy kind of solution, but there's actually a position in contemporary philosophy called panpsychism. And if you get interested in this, I can recommend a famous essay by one of my favorite philosophers, a guy by the name of Thomas Nagel. And he wrote an essay called Panpsychism. And he basically says, look, there's really no way of explaining how consciousness arises from matter unless at some level, matter is also conscious. There's been a lot of discussion recently about panpsychism. Some people think it's utterly crazy view, couldn't possibly be true. But there is this puzzle about how do you get conscious states which seem to be fundamentally qualitatively distinct from physical states, from physical objects, unless there was something conscious about the physical states. And Zongmi's solution is what we're calling physical states are really just projections of the one mind that has lost an awareness of the fact that these things are just projections of itself and are no different from itself. So Zongmi says he can solve the problem of consciousness as well. All right, so in today's lecture, I'm going to open it up for questions in just a second, but just to summarize, in today's lecture, we looked at some of the ways that Buddhism transformed when it came into China, and Buddhism brought with it changes in material culture and changes in practice, like it brought with it the concept of a celibate clergy, and it brought with it the practice of, veganism. I didn't really explain very well at the beginning. I mean, part of the idea behind veganism in Buddhism is, remember, there are no selves, at least no individual selves that distinguish you and me in Buddhism, but suffering is bad and pleasure or happiness is good. And so you're just trying to promote happiness and reduce suffering. But if you're going to do that, the suffering of animals counts as suffering, and the happiness of animals counts as happiness. So Buddhists think you shouldn't kill animals to feed yourself if you can avoid doing that. So it's a very natural alliance between veganism and Buddhism. And by the way, one more thing I wanted to mention just in passing, another aspect of material culture that Buddhism brought to China is the swastika as a symbol of Buddhism. So if you go to many places in East Asia, you may find a restaurant that has a whole bunch of swastikas on the awning. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, what am I looking at here? You're looking at probably a very good vegan Buddhist restaurant, because the swastika symbol developed in India. It was co-opted by the Nazis and became a symbol of evil in the West. But the same symbol, it's actually technically flipped. A Nazi swastika goes one way, and a Buddhist swastika actually is like a mirror image. It's flipped. But it doesn't, that symbol doesn't mean Nazism when you see it on restaurants or things in East Asia. In fact, until recently, tourist maps in Japan identified Buddhist temples with a swastika. And eventually, my understanding is they stopped doing that because they said too many foreigners were just horrified, like, why are the swastikas on this tourist map? And they had to learn, well, because the swastika here is not a symbol of Nazism, it's a symbol of Buddhism. So you can use it to identify a Buddhist temple or a Buddhist vegetarian restaurant. But so we talked about some of the ways that there's a cultural transformation as Buddhism came to China. It changed material culture in many ways. But then also there was an intellectual change as Buddhism argued that it wasn't that Confucianism and Daoism were simply false. It wasn't that they were immoral. It's that the teachings of Confucianism and Daoism are partial. And they can give you good advice on some topics, but they can't answer certain other questions. And then the idea is Theravada, or as Zongmi refers to it with the derogatory term, Hinayana, is a more profound teaching than Confucianism or Daoism, because it understands there's no self, and it understands the ethical implications of that. But only Mahayana, and in particular Huiyuan, the school of Mahayana that Zongmi belongs to, can answer all the ethical and philosophical issues that are raised by these schools. And so that's why he thinks it's the truest of the most ethically enlightened of the various schools. And this idea that you might hierarchically arrange different teachings is a very powerful one that you might want to consider for yourself in thinking about philosophy.